So, Tom, my goodness, we have quite the buffet to pick from today. Where would you like to begin?
I suspect that we can spend our whole time at the buffet discussing the Court of Appeal decision on Bill 21, Aaron. I'm still a little bit in shock at the scope of their defense of the notwithstanding clause's ability to evacuate any discussion about whether or not a bill is discriminatory. So let's go back to the Superior Court decision, what we call the first instance decision. Marc-André Blanchard, the judge there, said, look, there are definitely aspects of Bill 21 that are discriminatory, but they can remain, because they've invoked correctly the notwithstanding clause. Here, the Court of Appeal says, I don't even get to look behind the notwithstanding clause. I don't even have to express an opinion about whether or not this is discriminatory, which of course it is, because the notwithstanding clause is there. And it's interesting. They turn, we've talked about the notwithstanding clause any number of times. It's worth reminding people that that's simply a way for saying we have a law that we think might be challenged because it could be discriminatory. But what we're going to do is we're going to protect it. We're going to say that it operates despite the guarantees for rights in the Charter of Rights because we, the legislators, should have the final word. That's where the Court of Appeal lands. They say, look, it's the final word in a democracy is the democratically elected people, is the set of people in the National Assembly in this case, or in Parliament, and they're the ones who get to decide. That's what the notwithstanding clause is all about. They even talk about the sovereignty of the National Assembly and its ability to make the final determination. It goes very far. I know of no other decision of a senior tribunal court in Canada that goes anywhere near that far in a full-throated defense of the notwithstanding clause. So there are other things that are in there. I know that you've already had Joe Ortona on, and of course it's going to take his time to decide what else is going to happen with this. But my first reaction on seeing it, because it really is an across-the-board victory for François Legault and Bill 21, I was chuckling to myself because last week in another case, the Quebec Court of Appeal said, no, you can't exclude the children of asylum seekers from Quebec's publicly funded daycare system. And Legault just, got his knickers in a twist and said, well, who are these people? They're just named by Ottawa. Well, who cares? How am I going to make, our daycare should be pour les petits Québécois, for little Quebecers. It was very unseemly, and it was pure Legault. And I'm just smiling as I imagine his reaction today. He's going to probably come out saying what a fine institution the Quebec Court of Appeal is now that it agrees with them on something.
It's interesting. You can't imagine using that as the sort of reference, right? What happened when they went against him, if you will, for the daycare ruling? Mm-hmm. What would have happened today if they'd have gone? I mean, he would have lost it. I mean, he would have exploded today had they said, no, you can't use the notwithstanding clause to enforce Bill 21.
Yeah.
Would have been quite the reaction.
They were not going anywhere near that. Now, the most disturbing aspect, and I know that you're going to have my old friend and colleague Julius Gray on later on. You'll be able to talk about this in some detail, but I'll still take a first look with you at what it could mean for the control and management of minority language school boards. Now, there's a whole set of jurisprudence. Jurisprudence means previously decided cases. The most important one is called MAHE, M-A-H-E, from Alberta. Goes back quite a few years. It was rendered, interestingly enough, the Alberta decision, by a judge Mary Morrow, who just went to the Supreme Court of Canada. And what's happened since Bill Section 23 of the Canadian Charter was drafted, they've breathed a lot of life into the terms that are used in 23, that it goes beyond just the school. It's not just about the school. In French, it's les établissements. I'm pretty sure that in English it's the institutions, but I have to double check. But I know the French is établissement because it's in the judgment today. And what they do is they basically dismantle that. They seem, in my view, as a lawyer, they seem to completely ignore the dicta and that line of jurisprudence going back to MAHE. And they say, this doesn't, look at the section. This is the context. The section is about access to school in that language. And it's about the language of the classes and stuff. This doesn't talk about, it says, it's établissement. And they go so far as to say, and they're equating that word with school. Now, that's a reading down of rights that have already been built up by the Supreme Court. And I'll tell you a very interesting story. I was working as a lawyer in the legal department at the Conseil de la Langue Française in the early 80s as the Canadian Charter was being drafted. Now, Gérard Bertrand was the chief drafter of legislation for the Federal Justice Department, but he came and met us, and us being my other colleague, Michel Sparrer, recently passed. And Michel did a magnificent job. The first wording was about schools, and he said, well, why just talk about schools? Make it a little bit larger. Talk about les établissements. It could be control and management by the linguistic minority of everything around the schools. And sure enough, they went back to Ottawa, and that's the version that popped up. And I'll always give Michel credit for having had that vision, because breathing that life into Section 23 meant that the linguistic minority, the English in Quebec and the French outside Quebec, had more than a right to sit in a classroom. They had a right to control and manage. When Nova Scotia a few years ago got rid of school boards, they didn't dare touch the French boards because they knew the Maillet decision protected it. So on the first level, they're completely reading down a long jurisprudence that says that it's much more than just the school. They're actually going backwards on that. They're going back decades, frankly. But then there's something very interesting that pops up. And for people who are reading it, it's a long decision. It's in paragraph 605. You'll find it there. In that part of the judgment, they say, they're not telling people in the school board that they have to use a language other than English, and you're not telling professionals or anybody else. They have a long list of things that it doesn't do, Bill 21. But a lot of those things are in the interpretations that they're trying to impose on the English boards in Bill 96. So there's the smart lawyers, after they finished having their champagne over their victory on Bill 21, will be sitting down tomorrow and looking at that and saying, hold on now, this will really endanger our ability to impose certain rules of Bill 96 in the English school boards, because even though they've read it down and brought it down to the bare bones, the Quebec Court of Appeal is clearly saying, but don't you dare try to interfere and tell people that they have to use a language other than English in the English board. So that's an interesting thing that they should be looking at.
So celebrating a little prematurely then.
Yeah, on this one, yeah, because once they get an understanding of what's in the second part of that long paragraph 605, it's a long decision there, and it's several hundred pages. Once they get a look at that, they're going to realize that this might be opening up another can of worms with regard to Bill 96. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, let me move on. I wanted to get this in because I have a clip here. Pierre Poilievre taking Justin Trudeau down again today. Never mind ArriveCan, and we found out today that a government employee, I don't know if he still is or has been fired since then, had a side hustle, Tom, as it turns out. Worth about $9 million, getting a contract for the ArriveCan app. Did I mention he worked for the government? That's a story today. But then there's a story of the two scientists, right? Again, working for a government agency who were eventually caught basically selling secrets to or giving secrets to the Chinese government. So Pierre Poilievre said this.
Not only did he cover it up, not only did he try to get a vaccine from China after knowing this, he called a snap election to make sure that the voting would happen before this came out. And what happened in that election? Beijing interfered to help him win it.
So he's talking, of course, now about that decision. And we're finding about this now, Tom. Did we know about this before, other than when they were first fired?
No, there were rumors of it. There was speculation about it from the earliest days, but we didn't have the concrete evidence. You can like Poilievre or not like him, like his rhetorical style or not like it, but there is a fundamental truth to what he just said. And it's very disquieting for Trudeau. With regard to the ArriveCan app, part of what you were mentioning, Aaron, integrity issues are always huge at the ballot box. It takes a long time for them to get through, and it has to be, to quote the Donald, it has to be huge. It has to be something that really captures the imagination for the good and simple reason it's too big to sweep under that big rug. And the average Canadian, the average person, who doesn't spend all their days reading editorials and looking at all the fine details, the average person is going, what the, and I'll bleep out the last word, what is going on here? How did this happen? How could you give millions of dollars? None of this makes any sense. I've said since the beginning, that when this first started, I was telling people, come on, don't get ahead of yourself. Don't compare this to the sponsorship scandal. You know what? Layer by layer, it's like peeling an onion. This thing is showing itself to be as bad, if not worse, than the sponsorship scandal, and they're going to try to get control of this. There are going to be tons of debates about online harm legislation, about the new, prescription drug plan, Pharmacare and all these big policy issues. At the core, when people look at Trudeau's performance, they're going to say, you've increased the size of the civil service by 25%. Things still aren't great. And you've doubled from $7.5 billion a year to $15 billion a year, the amount that you give to outside companies like McKinsey, and things still aren't working in Ottawa. You're not good at getting stuff done. But when they see this, they're saying not only you're not good at getting stuff done, but you were throwing money out the window. It is impossible that nobody in your government knew that this stuff was going on, and you were just not able to deal with it. That's where the toughest judgment comes from the average Canadian voter, in my experience.
I would guess someone's head has to roll here.
Yeah, but that's too easy. You remember when Chuck Guite went to jail, and Paul Coffin, and in the spot. Yeah, sure. But what about all the people who were behind the sponsorship money? I don't remember any elected officials or senior people in the political cabinet or in their office. I don't remember that. I remember you go kind of low to medium down the totem pole,
right.
And there's a court process, and this is all done on the up and up. I mean, they weren't not guilty, but what about all the other ones? That's the real question.
Fair enough. Listen, I have like 30 seconds, which is a lie. I have less. But Jagmeet Singh came out today with this pharmacare bill and basically took a shot at Francois Legault for having told him we're not interested. Listen to this.
I think it's sad and it's disappointing that Premier Legault said no without even looking at the deal, without even looking at the plan. I want to say that it's wrong of the Premier to say no to women who want access to birth control, no to kids and families that are struggling with diabetes that don't have full coverage in Quebec. So ultimately, this is going to be a negotiation with provinces, and we want to see a negotiation where everyone gets the highest quality of care and everyone gets the same care, and I don't want Quebec to get less care.
Wow, he doesn't want Quebec to get less care, Tom.
But we don't get less care. We've got by far the most extensive pharmacare coverage in Canada, by far the most extensive. And I think that Mr. Singh would have been wise to say what you had to say, but say it slightly differently, because I'm convinced that the Quebec government's not going to say no to the money. And I'm also convinced that the feds are not going to try to tell Francois Legault that we have to get rid of our hybrid system where the private companies are involved as well, because we do have the most extensive coverage in Canada. If Trudeau could get anywhere near the coverage that Quebec has for all of Canada, it would be a major victory, but he's not there. So I think that Mr. Singh is getting a bit ahead of himself. He's had a great week. I've been writing and giving congratulations for how he did this and got something concrete on the table, especially with regard to diabetes. But I also think he's got to choose his fights wisely. And if I were his Quebec Lieutenant Alexandre Boulris, I'd be very concerned about the interpretation that's going to be made of those words.